We will be live in a few minutes. I hope you are having a beautiful day so far.
Presented by Page Wizard Games, Learning and Entertainment. It's that time, everybody. Time for more entertainment and fun with your favorite computer scientist, Dr. Daniel Page. Welcome to Dan Plays, where Dan has fun with friends and we talk about all sorts of fun things, including computer science and everything under the sun. No barriers, just fun. Check out all the fun rewards and supporter access at the links. That's enough for now. Let's get started. Come on, Dan. Let's get started.
Hello everybody, I hope everyone's having a beautiful day. I want to welcome you onto the stream or our lecture here today. It is early morning, and look who it is, it's Miss Kitty. Hello Miss Kitty. Yeah, you saying good morning to everybody? Yeah, you're one silly kitty. Yeah. Yeah, no, what do you have to tell me? What do you have to tell me, Miss Kitty? What do you have to tell me? Someone's birthday, I wonder whose birthday it is today. well, whoever it is, maybe it's my birthday. Is it my birthday today? I guess it's just that obvious. Okay, Miss Kitty. Well, thank you for the birthday wishes. Even Miss Kitty had to say happy birthday. No, thank you very much for birthday wishes. We're having ourselves some fun here today with something that's arguably a little bit tricky. A little tricky, but I think that I'll make it a little extra fun than it usually is. Okay. Hey, Miss Kitty. Miss Kitty, we have to get to the lecture here soon. let me just get the chat open here. I'll give you a couple of quick announcements before we get started. So first, before we get into everything, I just want to note what we're going to be talking about here today. So today we're going to be talking about something called the pumping lemma for regular languages. It's a property that all regular languages have. And the neat part about it is that you could use it to pick up and show that there are some languages that aren't regular. And up to this point in our lectures, we've seen that there is, we haven't seen any examples of languages that are not regular. So this will kind of diverge itself into a whole other topic of questions of existence of DFAs for certain languages, or even AMPHAs, or being able to express them with regular expressions. Right, Miss Kitty? Right, Miss Kitty? Yeah, Miss Kitty. Miss Kitty, somebody wants you over there. Here, go see. No, go see, Miss Kitty. But let's get to our announcements quickly. So, a couple quick things. So first thing is if you want access to the notes from today's lecture, they'll be available at patreon.com/pagewizard at the supporter access tier or above. It is just simply $5 Canadian per month to subscribe to this tier. And there's all sorts of other perks at various other tiers as well, such as the Discord server. So keep in mind, there's all sorts of educational resources that I have available at the various tiers. I encourage you to check it out if you really want to support this work. Even if you're just wanting to support creating more affordable computer science educational content here, or you enjoy what I do here, consider supporting. It keeps the lights on. So, other than this, of course, consider of course telling your friends to come join the fun. Since we're a little small here, it's important that other people know where to come. So please tell your friends if they're interested in computer science or learning about algorithms, especially the theoretical side of these things. Please tell them to come join the fun. We always have a blast over here. So that's the one thing. Another thing is I do have a survey for availability of those watching the stream. So we're doing our stream a little earlier today because it is, as we sort of revealed, it's my birthday today, and some people want to do things with me today. So okay, well I better make sure we got our lecture done here today. Make sure I have that fun time with everybody. But at the same time, I should mention that we have a survey to help us calibrate our live programming, because presently we have a live schedule where we do live streams on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I would like to figure out what best availability for people. And I've had a few people respond, which is great. I've actually got some interesting suggestions, because also in there I also ask for topics that you might be interested in and feedback on the video. So it's a good opportunity to give me some feedback other than in the comments. Please leave a comment, by the way, if of course you want to tell me anything, or you're curious about a certain topic, or you have a question. Please, I'm all ears for this sort of stuff. It's important for my craft to know what I'm doing wrong and what I'm doing right, okay? Whether it be your opinion or my opinion on it. And also, of course, topics. So I've so far gotten some pretty interesting topics. So far I've gotten suggestions for context-free grammars, Turing machines, and even things like randomized algorithms, which all definitely will go on the chopping block. I think those are excellent topic suggestions. I will mention that this month, for our live lectures, I will be planning to try to wrap up things with regular languages, though we may revisit it for more topics such as minimization of DFAs. But we'll be talking about the context-free languages probably next month, if not towards the end of this month. So for the participant that put that in, you're definitely in the right direction when it comes to suggestions, because I think that it's a great idea. But most certainly, there's some other things that we're going to be doing here. For example, I know that one of our patrons has suggested doing some programming. So I might be going back to my programming series. I have some new equipment for doing that, which will make things a lot more fun than it would have been in the past. So, for example, I have a lectern where I could put my computer right in the scene. And so I put together this lectern. It's pretty nifty looking. But yeah. Anyways, I hope you're excited for these projects, and of course, consider subscribing or following. That's one way you can always help out. So, that being said, we're going to be talking about today's topic, which is the pumping lemma. The pumping lemma. So you might ask, Dan, what the heck is the pumping lemma? And I think that this topic is generally covered in a way that's rather sloppy. Often it's just thrown at students without much intuition behind it. But once you see it, it's like, okay, that kind of makes sense, but where did it come from? How does this thing manifest itself? Like, once you see it and you maybe see the proof for it, it makes a lot of sense why it's true. But like, where the heck does it come from? And I hear that quite often from students where they hear, well, not my students, but from students when they talk about this topic, they just think it's sort of arbitrary and how you use it is a little bit strange. So I'm hoping to dispel some elements of this today. So, before we get into things today when it comes to the pumping lemma, I would like to talk a little bit about some aspects of the pumping lemma that have appeared in some discussions we may or may not have had in the past, but I would like to put everything together. So, just want to recap you where we are. It's a good idea. It's been a little while. So, we've talked about these things called regular languages. So what was our definition of a regular language? It was that it is a language for which there exists a deterministic finite automaton that recognizes it, right? There exists a deterministic finite automaton that recognizes it. That means that this machine, given all of the strings, any arbitrary set of strings on said alphabet, it is able to say accept for any one of the strings of that language and rejects all others. So another element of this I need to bring in is that we talked about Kleini's theorem, which is a characterization of the regular languages. Namely, we've also shown that I can take this part where I say DFA here, and when I say recognizes, I'm also going to include that it describes it. If you want to think about the DFA as a description of the language, you could replace this with a non-deterministic finite automaton. You could also replace this with an epsilon non-deterministic finite automaton. So this is where we have epsilon transitions or epsilon moves. So these are free moves I get to make without reading or consuming a symbol. And also we've talked about how we talked about regular expressions. And we've shown that you could describe a regular expression. Any regular language is described by a regular expression. We established this as a big part of Kleini's theorem. So just as a big picture, so keep in mind that's what the regular languages are. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be establishing a property that all of these regular languages have. And it brings me back to talking about the deterministic finite automaton. So just want to remind you of how a DFA works. So I'm just going to draw the transition diagram of such a machine. So we're not going to go too terribly deep on this definition. I just want to remind you of the concept. So imagine I have a DFA with 3 states like this. This is just an example of one. So I have 3 states. We indicate this as the start state. Any one I've put double lines around or double circled, those are final or accepting states. And of course, I have arrows. These are directed edges or arcs that take me from one state to another state on a symbol. So in this case, on the symbol 0, it transitions from Q0 to Q1. And of course, this is what my DFA is going to look like. So I have 3 states. And if I give you a string, for example, such as 0, 1, 0, what this machine will do with this string is it'll read symbol by symbol left to right. And on each, so it starts in the start state, here Q0. There's only one start state, just to be very clear, but there can be several final or accepting states. So I can go from here to there upon reading the 0, right? It consumes the 0, the transition from Q0 to Q1. Then it reads the next symbol. It goes Q1 to Q1, so it stays in the same state. And then it reads the 0 and it goes to Q2. Now, this machine finished reading the input, so it accepts because it's in a final state upon completing reading the input. Is that clear, everybody? So please take note that to go from one state to another requires me to have a transition. And also, if I want to go and get accepted, I have to get to an accepting or final state. So all DFAs can be depicted using these transition diagrams. So the one thing I really want you to notice here is I can give you many, many strings. And I must stress that this DFA accepts a certain set of strings, a language. So the language here looks something like this. So do note that I can go 0. So if I give it a string such as this, 0, 0, notice it can go from, it goes Q0 to Q1, it reads that. Q1 to Q2, it reads this, right? And it accepts that string. Do you notice that it can keep reading 1s and staying Q1 as long as the beginning and the end are 0, it can have 1s in the middle. So notice that this DFA so it accepts on strings of this form. 0, 1 to the n, 0 for any n greater or equal to 0. So it's allowed to have as many 1s as you want, 0 or more. So this set of strings, that's the regular, this is the language. And in fact, this DFA will correctly do that. I encourage you, if you're not convinced that this DFA is correct, to try sitting down and trying to prove it using some of the techniques we've seen in the past, such as state invariance. So this one has 3 states, so it makes it rather nice for applying the state invariant technique or argument that we had seen. Now, you might ask, why should I care about this at this point? So the ultimate question I would like to be able to address for you requires me to have a property that all regular languages have. Now, there's more than one way to characterize or give properties for regular languages, but the ultimate question I would like to answer is one that we asked some time ago. I'll rephrase it like this. Is every language regular? So in plain language, that means that if I give you any language, if this is the case, if it says yes, if the answer is yes to this, that means that I can always give you a deterministic finite automaton that recognizes that language. If the answer is no, that means that there's going to be some languages, perhaps many languages, for which I can never design a DFA for them, nor NFA, nor one of these, nor describe it with a regular expression. So we're going to ultimately answer this question once we've seen this property. So let me come back now to this, and I really want to emphasize something about the strings that get accepted by this DFA. There's specific kinds of strings that we're going to be interested in. So let's consider strings of this form. So consider strings W with length at least the number of states accepted by a DFA. You might ask, Dan, why would I consider that? Well, let's think about it. Let's think about this. And I want to come back to thinking about how this DFA executes as a walk or path. So when it reads each one of these, so last time when we talked about Kleini's theorem, we talked actually about how this path is like a set of, it gives me instructions from going from one state to another state. It is a label for a walk or pathway. So for example, when I read off 0, 1, 0, notice it's just me following with my finger going 0, 1, 0. Now, you'll notice that the first example, unlike the second example I have there, the length of the string is at least the length the number of states, right? But let's think about that. What does that mean? What does that mean? So imagine I take this rope and I start right here. And I want to go from Q0 to Q2, which is the only final state in this DFA. And I ask you about string W in this circumstance. There's an interesting thing that might be popping up with strings of this length. So you imagine I want to go from Q0 to Q2 in this example. Remember, this is just an example. Does such a W repeat a state? So that's a question I have for you. Does this W have to repeat a state? And the reason why I picked this example is because it's just a single, like notice that it's just, you go from Q0, Q1 to Q2, right? To get accepted, you have to go through this pathway at some point. But remember, DFAs may have multiple branching pathways where it may be the case there's multiple states. But remember, in terms of the execution of the DFA, it may as well just be examining one path. It may go through multiple states, but the point is if it gets accepted, it gets to some final state. So let's think about it. How many states are there here? There are 3 states. But if this length of my string is 3, how many transitions had to have occurred? How many transitions have to occur? So I go from Q0 to Q2. How many transitions have to occur to get to Q2, if that's the case? That's a good guess, but it's a little more than just that, right? Because remember, I have to go Q0, Q1, and then I have to go to Q2. So there's going to be at least 2 transitions that have to happen. But remember, the DFA works by reading one symbol at a time, right? It reads it left to right, and there's 3 symbols. So that means there's going to be how many transitions then? There's 3 symbols. It reads one after the other, and it follows the transitions on reading each symbol. So like we had here, we had 0, 1, 0. So how many transitions happen? It's 3. It's 3 transitions happen. But that's the thing. If there's 3 transitions and there's 3 states, let's answer this question. Does W repeat a state? So if I were to trace out the transitions. So for example, for this, what it looks like is this. Q0, Q1, Q1, Q2, right? So that's what it would look like. Because I go from Q1 to Q1, and then I go to Q2. So it means that the number of transitions that are happening is 3, right? But namely, notice that this equals the number of states, or it does repeat. Yeah, exactly. Yes, and there's a graph theoretic reason for this example. And this is something we talked about a little bit when we talked about graph theory in the past, is if I wanted to go from Q0 to Q2, if I think of this like a directed graph, if I have 3 transitions, that means the path is going to have to go to 3 different vertices. And I start here and I have to visit 3 vertices. I only have 2 more vertices, right? So there's not really any other options but to repeat one. So we would posit in this case that there exists a cycle in such a graph, if we think about the transition diagram as a graph. So there is a cycle that exists, namely it's this one right here on the so-called self loop, if we think about this in graph theoretic terms. So what would that look like then? So what is this going to look like? So for transitions for any such string, have 3 parts. So the first part are the transitions prior to. So now I'm going to give a name to this repeating state. We're going to call it, for our point of our discussion, PI. So in our example here, PI is always going to be Q1. So in this example, Q1 is PI. I should say to some PI, because keep in mind there could be multiple repeats. But I want to give a name to the one for which it might repeat. In our example, it's always going to be Q1. But in other DFAs, it may not be. And then you have, of course, the transitions from PI through some transitions back to PI. So in our example, it just goes PI to PI, right? But it could be the case that there's multiple transitions that happen and then eventually comes back over here. Then the last part is the transitions from the last time PI is visited to a final state. So that's the structure of any one pathway or walk that I could take. So if imagine I'm walking from here to there to over there. Any such path has to look like this. And I picked this DFA specifically to make it easier for us to see this, right? So that's actually every one of the accepting paths. So a pathway that gets me to an accepting state, i.e. the string that I'm reading off dictates what this path will be. It always will have a form that looks like this, if the length of the string is at least the number of states. So that gives us an interesting idea here. If that's the case, if there's a repeat state, so a state I can keep going to, I can actually discover more strings that get accepted by the DFA as a consequence. So we can discover more strings accepted by the DFA by taking 2 0 or more times. Now you might ask, Dan, what do you mean by that? So let's think about strings that get accepted by the DFA. Well, we're already actually seen one right here. Do you notice that if I were to take this string, and you remember the path it takes is this? Do you notice that if I choose not to take the self loop, this exactly corresponds to this one right here, right? So that's just 0, 0. So I can give you other strings that get accepted by this DFA, such as 0, 0. We had 0, 1, 0, right? That's where you take the self loop once, because that's where we have the repeat state, right? But notice that I can actually keep continually using the repeat state in this example, but I must stress that it could generalize where it could be that you visit other states too, but come back to the repeat state. But the point is that the repeat state exists. So that means that also I can take that self loop twice. I can even take it 3 times. Miss Kitty, did you knock the string down? What a menace. And so on. But we can exploit the fact that 2 exists to find more strings. And this brings us to a characterization for the regular languages. So this is so actually I should use the word characterization per se. It's a broader property that all regular languages satisfy. A characterization it has. So this brings us to what the pumping lemma is. So let's talk about what the pumping lemma is. Okay, Miss Katie? Yeah, you being a little menace. Now you might ask, why is it called the pumping lemma? I'll give you an example in a moment. All it is just a phrasing of what we've talked about over here. So let me state the pumping lemma, and then I'll give you the intuition behind what we're doing over here, because I've actually just shown it to you up front. So let L be a regular language. Let L be a regular language. There exists constant P. And I must stress that this depends on L. And often this P, this constant, is called the pumping length. It's often called this. So there exists this constant P such that for all strings W that are in the language with length, so I'm going to denote the length like this, of the string W is at least this pumping length. String W can be rewritten like this, into 3 parts, X, Y, and Z. So to be a bit more precise about what I'm saying here, W can be dissected into 3 substrings. String W with this decomposition or dissection exists such that, or I'll say where, just because I'm going to have a lot of such that's coming up. It's going to sound like a little bit of a mouthful if you've never seen this before. Where the following is the case. 1, the Y part isn't going to be empty. So it's not the empty string. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the length of xy, if I just consider x then y, the length of this string here cannot exceed P, the pumping length. And 3, the third property, is for every k greater or equal to 0, the string x, y to the k, z is in the language L. This should kind of give you some alarm bells. You should feel like your ears are ringing because something like this sounds awfully familiar, right? Because in our example here, I just showed you such a W, right? For that language. So do you notice how when in our example we had it where this Y part relates to that self loop and revisiting it over and over again, right? But here's the point I'm getting at. We're going to have it where there exists this string W so just to be very clear, for all strings W with this length, you can decompose it like this into, so it has these 3 properties, as we discussed over here. So let me give you the ideas just in plain language, just to summarize everything we've said, because I want to make sure you understand what the pumping lemma is. Here's the idea. So for any string W in the language, where the length of the string is at least this pumping length, I'll say there is always a non-empty string Y near the beginning of W that can be pumped. That is, one can repeat Y 0 or more times, 0 more times, the resulting string is in the language L. That's the idea of the pumping lemma. So we actually seen an example over here, and my example will help give you an intuition once we see the proof of the pumping lemma, what the pumping length might be. And you might ask, Dan, why is it called this? So remember when we talked about strings that get accepted by the DFA, just in our example here, do you notice how when I want to come up with more strings that can be accepted by the language, notice that I can keep repeating the Y part 0 more times. So we say that it's pumping it. We're pumping Y. So it's just like I'm going pump, pump, pump. So I can pump up the string like this by repeating that Y part. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about the pumping lemma, is that it shows that there's going to be a way I can always come up with more strings for the language, namely by pumping Y. So that's the pumping lemma. Are there any questions about the pumping lemma so far? Any questions at all? Because we're going to prove this.
No questions yet.
But yeah, remember the big intuition here is that the strings have to have at least a certain length in association with this so-called pumping length. And I gave you a bit of a hint of what the pumping length would be in the proof. Do you notice that if I pick the pumping length in the right way, which I must stress that, so that means that it has to exist and it depends on that language. I want to have a way that I can always pick the pumping length, regardless of what the language is, so that I can just tell you, hey, look, here's what the pumping length can be. And then I'm going to try using properties that we had in our intuition here. Because we talked about this idea of being able to repeat a state, and I would like to have conditions for which that happens. And I gave you one such example. And that's actually what's going to play out in the proof. So I'm just going to erase the board over on this side, because we're going to recap on this, just to re-summarize it. But if you got my example over here, over on this board, you'll get an idea of how the proof is going to play out. Because we're going to exploit that structural property of our DFA. Namely, the existence of a cycle. Because once we have a cycle, that means there's going to be some state or vertex, if you think about it in terms of a graph, where it's going to have to repeat it. And then we're going to try to come up with a way we can formalize this. We want to formulate a way that we can pin that down, so we can talk about those three parts exactly in the way we talked about here in our example. So you know how I had the three parts here? That's what's going to happen in the proof. So I'm just giving you a heads up that we're going to have something like that happen, but I need to be able to formulate carefully what that pathway that the execution takes on. And that's going to be the tricky part in the proof, is understanding how we can do this. And it's going to take a careful relabeling or description of the execution of the DFA to accomplish this. So far there aren't any questions, so I think we're okay to proceed. So let me just do that. Just gonna wait for the board to get over here. Otherwise, it gets a little bit weird when I start talking about proofing things. Actually, no. Let's keep it over there. We want to talk about the pumping lemma. I want to make sure I recap this for you guys, because otherwise, because it is a mouthful. I will mention that there are other pumping lemmas for other kinds of languages, if I were to give you a little bit of a spoiler. But this one is the classic. So usually people, when they talk about pumping lemma, they're talking about this specific one in regard to regular languages. So last time we had talked about this idea of what we call the pumping lemma. I gave you some intuition behind it, and I wanted to formalize it now with you. So we're going to be proving now the pumping lemma. So I just wanted to restate the pumping lemma first and give you a quick intuition or recap from last time. And then we're going to prove this sucker. So let L be a regular language. There exists a constant P. And remember, we said that this is also known as the pumping length. And it depends on the language. So when we think about this constant P, we're going to have some way when we prove the claim how we can determine what that P is. Such that for all strings in the language, with the length being at least the pumping length, you can take the string W. It's going to be able to be broken into these three parts where it has these three properties. First, the Y part is non-empty, meaning that it consists of at least one symbol. This Y part happens near the beginning of the string, namely that XY of the first two parts of this three-part decomposition or dissection of the string into three substrings. The first part and the second part cannot be any longer than the pumping length. And the third property is that for every k greater or equal to 0, I can tell you that the string xy to the k z is in the language L. And we call this the pumping lemma because I get the opportunity to pump y. What does that mean? It means that for any string w, where the length is at least the pumping length, there's always going to be a non-empty string y near the beginning that can be pumped. And that means that I can take y, I can repeat it 0 or more times. That's what I refer to as pumping. We're pumping that string. So each one of those for different k's there. For example, xz would be in that language. XYZ is in the language. XYYZ is in the language. XYYYZ is in the language, and so on for that third property. So we're going to be proving the pumping lemma next. So when I first introduced the pumping lemma to you, I gave you some intuition behind the underlying mathematical machinations of this thing. And there's the dreaded M word again, but it's rather important here. So we're going to prove this claim now. So suppose L is regular. What does that mean by definition? At least how we define the regular languages. It means there exists a DFA, right? There exists a DFA. So then, by definition, there is a DFA, M. I'm going to call it M. M for machine. Where L of M, so the language of this machine is equal to L. Now, suppose, so this is where that P part's the pumping leg's gonna come up, and this will remind you of the example we did earlier. Suppose M has P states. This should just make your ears ring a little bit if you've seen our example where we constructed such a DFA. That meets some of the conditions we had over here. So I must stress that you can't always do that. But the point is that in that example, I tried to highlight some elements of the pumping lemma. Suppose M has P states. And let the transition function, delta, so I'll let delta be the transition function of M, and Q0 be the start state. So now we're going to consider a string Y. So an arbitrary string. We're not going to do Y. I was about to say Y. I meant W. W, which meets the conditions of this theorem, where the length of Y is at least the pumping length. Which, remember now, the pumping length is the number of states of this DFA. Akin to our example we had seen. Such that W is equal to A1, A2, and so on, AM. So it's going to be equal to this string. So it's going to go A1, A2, A3, A4, all the way up to AM, one after the other, with M being at least P, and every AI is an input symbol. Now, you might ask, Dan, what are we going to do now? Because I don't know what the DFA actually looks like, right? This is a complete, I don't know what the DFA is, right? I just know it exists. Because that's what I got for free when it was regular, right? I brought into existence a DFA. I don't know what the DFA looks like. So here's the technique we're going to use. We're going to take and we're going to imagine we're going to lay on top of the DFA labels that are going to represent the states that are in the DFA based on the transitions that it takes with W. So it's like we're going to take our DFA and imagine I go there with some tape. So I'm going to go over there and I'm going to give names to those states. And I'm going to go over there and I'm just like, okay, even if the DFA had different names for these things, I'm going to give them labels that are going to make it easier for us to do it. So for example, if the state is literally called like Q1 or Q2 or something, I'm going to call it like P something. So I'm gonna like put the piece of tape on there and I'll say, this is what that state is. So I can give it names, because remember, I don't know what these look like in the action. Like, remember, this has to work regardless of what the DFA looks like, right? So I'm going to give names to these states. And remember, I'm going to consider an arbitrary string, and these labels are going to represent and be assigned per W. So you'll see what I mean in a moment. For each I is equal to 0, 1, 2, all the way up to P. So I'm going to give labels to these states now, as I talked about. Just imagine I'm taking out the tape. I'm going to put them on top of the states. So imagine I draw out the transition diagram. I'm just going to put tape on those ones, and I'm going to give them names as per the execution of the DFA with respect to W. Because remember, I can always label them per W each time, right? I can consider any one like this, and I can just label them. And the natural thing is going to come back to thinking about it just like a walk or path of the execution of the DFA. And those labels are going to be how it's going to play out. So I'm going to put labels. Imagine I'm just taking that big roll of tape and I'm just going to take out pieces. I'm going to label parts of the states. Because remember, I don't know what they are, but I most certainly know, based on its existence, how it's going to operate. But I have names for these things, right? I don't know for a fixed one what it's going to do until I see it, right? But I know that it does indeed compute just like any other DFA. So we're going to define PI, so that's what the name of our states are going to be. It's going to be P0, P1, P2, all the way up to P. I know I had a little bit of fun with that one. to be whatever the result of the extended transition function from Q0 upon reading A1, A2, all the way up to AI. i.e., PI is the state M is in after reading the first I symbols. Of W, where I'm going to just simply define that P0 is equal to Q0. Because when I haven't read any symbols, right, where does that take me? Well, by the definition of this, if I haven't read any symbols yet, you'd agree with me that I'm just staying at the start state, right? So this is how I'm going to define each one of my labels for the states. So these are going to be states that are going to be describing what we had seen before when we went for a little walk in the DFA. So that's what P0, P1, P2, all this are. I must stress, for those that are quite literally looking at this and be like, okay, well, you have a P here and you have a P here. Remember, this was describing a state with a subscript. This P here is meant to be a number. So I must stress, for those that are quite literally looking at this and be like, Dan, you used P twice. Just think of this as a stylized P, like this is a special label, okay? A special number, a constant, the pumping length. So if you don't like that, just like add a little italicize this or boldface this, which is what you would typically do, okay? I just had to make that remark. So now, we have how many states now? Well, I want to remind you what this all looks like, right? So it's going to look something like this, right? Let me just draw it over here, because we're going to use this to help us with our intuition here. And this will remind you a little bit of something we've seen before. So I have P0. So remember, that's where we start the DFA. Its execution's at. And you would have P1, P2, and so on. Stuff will happen here. Stuff happens in here. And then eventually I get to some state Pi. And maybe some other stuff happens. And then I go from there to the final state. And that would be P. So, anyways. Okay. So please note how many states I have just labeled here. How many are there? How many are there? Are there P that I've labeled, or is it P plus 1? Take note of the indexing I used here. So how many distinct states are there? Well, let's think about it now. This is the conundrum, right? How many are there? Well, that's what you would think, right? But this is the catch. Is remember, how many states does the DFA actually have? It's P, right? So here we go. This is what we'd seen previously when we thought about this. So check this out. So notice that so even though I've listed out P plus 1, right? There's P plus 1, right? But the thing is there's only P states, right? Notice there cannot be P plus 1 distinct states. Distinct states. Distinct states or distinct states P, or I'll say distinct PIs to make this even more fun. There cannot be P plus 1 distinct PIs, as there are only P states. Namely, the pumping length states, right? There's only that many. Now, people ask Dan, why is it so important that I have some knowledge of this whole discrete M word thing, the mayonnaise, the mustard? Because when you stare at something like this, when I have a collection of things, and I want to ask, can I categorize all those things with respect to the number of things I have? What I just said to you is that you can't take each one of these and put them into the same buckets as the number of states, right? There's going to be one extra. There's a lovely theorem that we had talked about before when we've explored discrete mathematics. It starts with a P as well. It seems like today is just full of P. Let's see here. What was it called? This thing where I put like cats in boxes and things like that. And if I don't have enough boxes for each one of the cats, I had to put at least 2 cats in the same box. Well, it was this thing called the pigeonhole principle. This is actually one of those classic places where you'd use the pigeonhole principle in computer science. But it appears all sorts of places, but this is one that a lot of people will point at and say, this is why you should be aware of the pigeonhole principle. That is, I was going to say there is, that is, by the pigeonhole principle, there exists 2 integers I and j, because you remember, think about these as if I uniquely numbered the states. Kind of like over here, right? 2 integers I and j, so that we're going to have it so I and j are sandwiched between 0 and the pumping length. and states Pi is going to be equal to Pj. So somewhere between 0 and P, right, because of the way we defined each of these Pi's, they're going to be along the walk that we take to get to the final state, right? Just like we have here. What I'm saying is that because of the pigeonhole principle, there's going to be two indices, two integers, I and j, such that this I is going to be equal, like Pi is going to be equal to Pj. So it means that even though it can happen later on, it's going to happen such that it's going to be, or Pi is going to be equal to Pj. So when I come around with my stickers, when I labeled P, like Pi and Pj, they're going to land on the same state. Is that clear, everybody? So I didn't say anything about that earlier, but most certainly that's what's going to happen because it exists that it's going to happen. There's going to be some time I'm going to have to label one of these twice. But it doesn't mean I throw it away. It just simply means I'm going to use that label to help us talk about what we're going to do next. So now this is where we're going to start trying to establish these conditions about the dissection of W. So let's look a little more carefully at what we had over here for this diagram. Now remember, the diagram isn't a part of the proof. It's meant to help us understand what's going on. So let's see what we could do now. And we're going to try using the intuition that we built previously to establish the remainder of, like, the actual guts of the pumping lemma. I was about to say the P, but we're not going to go there today. So then we can divide W into the three parts, X, Y, and Z. Because remember, W is in the language, right? So please remember that. It's a very important element of this. Otherwise, you couldn't guarantee that when you execute the DFA that you get to a final state. So remember, I'm just labeling some of the states that are taking me to that final state. So let me just take that picture again. And I'm just going to draw it again up here to help us see what's going on here. So I had P0. I have Pi, and I have some final state. And that takes me, so I do some stuff after I approach P0. Some stuff happens, and then I get over here, right? So what can we say here? Well, let me write out what X, Y, and Z might be. So let's check this out. So X is A1, A2, all the way up to AI. So that means that X makes us reach state Pi. And I must stress that X might be empty. There's nothing stopping X from being empty. You could just get straight to Pi right away. So that's what X is. So X is going to be here, right? So X is A1, A2, all the way up to AI. All of the transitions, so this would be like the part of the pathway that I take and I follow with my finger that gets me right here. Next, based on what we discussed previously, I get AI plus 1, AI plus 2, all the way up to AJ, right? And we established that when I get to reading AJ, where does that put me? That puts me back at Pi, right? Because Pi is equal to Pj. So take note of the subscripts here. So y takes us back to pi, which is equal to pj. But remember, y is not empty. That's the thing you really need to notice, right? It's not empty. I want you to think about why it's not empty. So remember, x can be empty, but y can't be empty. But remember what we said about the pigeon principle. Remember, we get two integers such that they're sandwiched in between here, but they're two distinct numbers, right? So that's what y is. So y is right here. So if I were to follow my finger around, it would get me back here after the DFA has read this. Then the third part. Z is aj plus 1, aj plus 2, all the way up to am. So this is just simply the rest of w. Again, z may be empty. Now I've shown you how you can decompose or dissect, whatever fun word you'd like to use for today. I showed you how you could dissect the string into 3 parts. Now I got to show you the third property, right? Because remember, we established that y is not empty, right? What are the things that we have to establish? That xy is at least the pumping length, right? But what do we know? Most certainly, notice that j is at least the pumping length. But that's the end of y, right? That's the end of y. So that means that we've satisfied the second condition. The third condition, this is the one that's I would argue is the most interesting part about this, is the one that allows us to discover more strings that are accepted by the language by pumping y. So this is the last part of the proof. Consider when m processes string x, y to the k, z for any k greater or equal to 0. Let's break it into 2 cases. First, we're going to look at when k is equal to 0, what happens with the DFA, and we're going to look at what happens when k is greater than 0. So we're going to break it into cases. So if k is equal to 0, then what happens? Then m receives input xz. And what does it do? What does it do? Let's follow with our finger, okay? So if I give you xz, what does it do? It goes boop. It follows all the way along, gets over to pi, and since there's no y part, right? It goes all the way to the final state. And that's what's going to happen when k is equal to 0, right? And goes from p0 is equal to q0 to stage pi on x. Since pi is equal to pj, m then goes from state pi to a final state on input z. So that means that m accepts xz. But what does that mean? It means it's a part of the language, right? So that's the first possibility. There's another possibility, right? So let's consider the other possibility right here. I want to mostly have it so we can see that picture over there to help us think about how the DFA executes along the pathway that we've discovered. So let's think about this. So otherwise, so another possibility is otherwise k is greater or equal to 0. And then m transitions from q0 equals p0. Or is it P1? Transitions from here to PI, right? On X. That's what it does, remember? It goes from here, follow along the transitions to get me here. Then what does it do? What's it do? How many times does it repeat? Follow along this. How many times does it do it then? It's going to use that Y part. How many times? I'll start writing and you tell me, okay? Then goes from PI to PI. Exactly how many times? Because remember, the string has this form, right? So k is now greater than 0, so it's going to take this alternative route. But the thing is, the route depends on k, right? So how many times is it going to repeat y? Namely, what is the DFA going to transition on? So it's how many times is it going to go from PI to PI? So there's going to be potentially some other states that happen in between here because PI is equal to PJ, right? But how many times does it happen? It happens k times, exactly k times. So it does it exactly k times on input y to the k. And then goes to the accepting state. The accepting state on input z. Accepting our string, right? Accepting x, y to the k, z. Now that we've considered all possibilities that can happen with k, now we can summarize the last condition and we've established the truth of the claim. So for any k greater or equal to 0, sorry, I'm getting really excited here. X, y to the k, z is also accepted by m, implying that x, y to the k, z is in the language L. And that completes the proof. So that concludes the proof for the pumping lemma. So remember, we satisfied the three properties for how we can dissect W. So it's x, y, and z. And remember, the point here is that W has at least the pumping length, which in our proof is the number of states of the DFA. And the whole trick here that we had was that we gave labels to the states for which W would execute. And then we noticed that, akin to what we previously discussed, that there's not going to be enough states for me to describe them all as distinct. There's going to be a repeat that happens. And we just gave names to those, and then we were able to characterize what the path or walk that the DFA takes when it's executing string W. So are there any questions about the proof? Any questions at all? I hope I made it a little easier to understand, because I know that some people, when they hear the pumping lemma, like at first it sounds a little obscure and strange, but I'm hoping that I gave you some concrete understanding of what this thing is actually doing. Yes, Miss Kitty, I know. I know, right? Yes, hello, Miss Kitty. Hello. But you might say, Dan, that's awfully a cute property that the regular languages have, and every regular language has this property. Is that if you give me a sufficiently long input string that is a part of that language, that I can pump a part near the beginning of it to come up with more strings that are accepted by the same DFA, or equivalently, it's just a part of the language. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to erase the boards, and then I'm going to show you an application of the pumping lemma. So you might say, Dan, application? What's that all about? And I must stress that this is typically the killer application of the pumping lemma. The pumping lemma itself is interesting about for a moment until you think it's just a bunch of fun graph theory, really just coaxed into machines, right? It's really a question about if there exists a cycle, and once you have a cycle like that, you could figure out if there's more strings. So I'm just going to erase the boards here, and then we're going to talk about this. And then we'll see an example. But what I'm planning to do is when we talk more about this topic, probably in a week or two from now, I'm going to do a lot more examples doing and carrying out these procedures. So just because I'm only going to do one example today doesn't mean we're going to be talking. That's it for the topic. We'll talk much more about it. So I'll be showing you plenty of examples of applying the pumping lemma. Okay, so I'm looking forward to talking about this because it gets a little bit funny. And for those that aren't in tune with thinking about logic and quantifiers, it's going to look a little bit like a nightmare, so I'm hoping I'm going to be able to discern this in a way that's fairly easy to follow. So let's check this out. So previously we had talked about what the pumping lemma is. It is a property that all regular languages have. Namely, if L is regular, so if I give you a regular language, L, it has to satisfy this pumping lemma. And we proved it. We talked all about what it is and how you could derive it. Then L satisfies the pumping lemma. I might ask, Dan, what the... So let's recap what the pumping lemma exactly says. But I'm going to try to do it in a way that is trying to be explicit where the quantifiers are. So I'm going to put this into two pieces, and we're going to just rip apart the logic of the whole thing. It's going to help us see what we can use this pumping lemma for, just as an example. So there exists. So notice it's an existential quantifier for those that know what that is. There exists pumping length P such that what? For all strings. So notice a universal quantifier for strings of the following form. For all strings W in the language with length at least the pumping length, there exists, notice there's an existential quantifier, there exists a way to write W is equal to the three parts, right? X, Y, and Z, such that such the following. Such that we had these properties, right? That y is not equal to the empty string, meaning its length is at least 1. That the length of xy is at least the pumping length. And so these two I'm just going to lump together because it's easy enough for them to just be paired up like this. And for all k greater or equal to 0, string x y to the k z is in the language. So you might be staring at this and say, Dan, yeah, you talked about the pumping lemma before. Why'd you break it out into quantifiers like this? It's because I want to talk about something else that at first, when you first look at this, say, oh, like that's cute that every one of the regular languages satisfies the pumping lemma. But there's this thing in logic we have called the contrapositive. And it goes like this, if I were to apply it to this statement. So the contrapositive of the above statement is the following. So, and it makes a lot of sense, right? If you think about this in terms of common sense reasoning, you think, okay, L is regular, that means it satisfies the pumping lemma. What would it mean if L doesn't satisfy the pumping lemma? Remember, it's a property that all regular languages have. What does that mean? If L does not satisfy the pumping lemma, remember, this is a property that all regular languages have. So what can I say about L then? Then L is not regular. Right? Because that's a property that all regular languages have. So this is the contrapositive of this statement. So this is actually one of the killer applications of the pumping lemma, is that you can use it to eliminate possibilities of their existing DFAs, NFAs, epsilon NFAs, or regular expressions for a given language that you're interested in. So if you can show me that L doesn't satisfy the pumping lemma, then you can exclude it as a regular language. It means it's some other kind of language that we haven't talked about yet. So you might ask, Dan, okay, so what does that mean then? So what does it mean then to not satisfy the pumping lemma? So to satisfy the pumping lemma is actually right here. This is the pumping lemma. So now let's go through the exercise of negating that. So, and the reason why I did it like this is because this has a lot of quantifiers in it. There's it exists. And once you get to that part, then you're going to say for all strings, there exists a way to write it like this, such that it has this, where it satisfies this. You see, there's a lot of quantifiers, right? Let's think about this now. So this is the pumping lemma. And this is where I try to simply just take the pumping lemma. So what does it mean for it to not satisfy the pumping lemma? Well, what does it mean? Well, if it says there exists, that means that it has to not just be that it exists. To reject this claim means that I have to show you that regardless of what this pumping length is, so I can imagine I have this. So instead, what does it mean for the pumping lemma not to apply? It means for all p greater or equal to 1, there exists, so remember, you see an existential quantifier, that means that you're going to need a universal quantifier to negate that. So after that, then we have to talk now about the string. That's the next part here, right? Do you notice now it says for all strings. That means that there has to exist a string. We're going to flip the reasoning here. There exists string W in the language with where its length is at least p, the pumping length, such that, now this is where it gets a little bit weird at first, is remember, it said that there was a way to write it's such that it's written into these three parts, and it has these properties, right? Well, now we have to say, regardless of how you could write it. So that means we're going to switch that to an existential to a universal. So here we go. Such that for all x, y, z that are in sigma star, w is equal to x, y, and z at least one condition because remember, it has to satisfy all of these, right? So for it to be invalidated, one of these has to be false. At least one condition below doesn't hold. So that means that one of the ones we have listed here has to be wrong. So one of these has to fail. And typically when you prove that a language isn't regular using the pumping lemma, usually your best friend is this one right here. Because to falsify this claim, remember it says for all, to show that this doesn't hold, because remember, universal, when I negate that's an existential claim. So all I would have to do is pick a k such that whatever I get isn't in the language. That's usually your best friend when you're proving a language isn't regular using the pumping lemma. But please note, and this is a common pitfall for students, is that you don't have control over how this string gets decomposed into these three parts. Notice that it's for all of these. Unlike over here, there exists some way to do it. That's what the pumping lemma says. Here it has to be that you have no control over that. So you can imagine this like a game that you're playing with someone, where if somebody were to propose to you that something it doesn't satisfy the pumping lemma, so some language doesn't satisfy it, you can imagine it like a game. So if somebody were to propose this to you, you can imagine this as the strategy on the other side, how you'd refute their claim. So you can almost look at it like a two-player game where you follow through each one of these steps, one after the other, and you could see how somebody could refute the claim. Pretty nifty, right? So let's do an example now, applying this argument. Because if we can put this into the form of an argument, we'll have our first example of showing that a language isn't regular. And remember, the implications of this, remember that a language is regular if there exists some DFA that recognizes it, right? And by Claney's theorem, we've seen that all bunch of different other ways we could also describe regular languages, right? Such as NFAs, regular expressions. That means that it excludes the existence of these things. So meaning that if you give me a language that is not regular, don't expect there to be a DFA. That means you're going to need something else to describe those things, and I don't know yet what we're going to do with those. So let's try using the pumping lemma. I'm going to abbreviate it as PL just to make it shorter for us. Let's try using the pumping lemma to prove a language is not regular. So we're going to establish the following language isn't regular. And I must stress that this isn't the only one. There's many, many, many of these. There's so many of them I couldn't count them all for you. So we're going to consider what I'm going to call L equals. So notice that this string always has the following form. It is where the number of zeros and the number of ones are equal to each other. So for example, a string like this, that's a part of this language, where you have equal numbers of zeros and ones. So this would also be in that language. So take note, and you'd stare at this and be like, really? There's no DFA for that? And the answer is, there is no DFA for this. Do you notice how the M's, they're arbitrary? If they were fixed, most certainly you could come up with a DFA for it, akin to some of the examples we've seen previously. Like if it was just that those were some constants, then most certainly you can play around with that. But anyways, here's what we're going to prove. Here's the theorem that we're going to prove now. So we're going to go through the game plan here. We're going to walk through it carefully. So language equals, or LEQ, is not regular. So let's prove that this is not regular. So we're going to put the pumping lemma into use. So proof. So the canonical best friend that you would have when you have something like this over here is contradiction. That's your best friend, because if you imagine it like we're playing the game we talked about, the way you would formulate the argument showing that this isn't regular is very much like if I were to take what I originally said about it being regular, so it satisfies the pumping lemma, and refuting it by giving you an argument that's of the form on the right side over here. So check this out. So we're going to assume LEQ is regular. And I must stress, we're doing this for the sake of deriving a contradictory statement. Then, if it's regular, then it satisfies the pumping lemma. Then by the pumping lemma, the pumping length, which remember, it's a constant, right? The pumping length P, as in the pumping lemma, exists. So, you might say, Dan, what are we going to do here? Okay, so remember, the statement of the pumping lemma, we have that constant, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little game of batting this around here. So now, to refute, to get the contradiction I would like to have, I'm going to present a string to you with the properties that would satisfy what we would need, right? Namely, one that's of a sufficient length. So notice that there exists a string W with that length being at least the pumping length. Remember, now we know it exists because we've assumed it's regular, right? So now I need to come up with a string that's going to be a part of that language. But it has to be at least length P, the pumping length. So here's one. This isn't the only one you can use, but most certainly this will cut it. Consider when W, the string W, so remember, notice that I'm asking for a string. To make this work, to refute the claim, I'm going to come up with one string that has the properties I described over here. That's enough to refute or come up with a contradictory statement. Because that means that I'm going to get a whole bunch of garbage out of assuming that this is regular, right? I'm going to get a contradiction. Consider this string. 0 to the P, 1 to the P. Is this a part of the language? Yeah, it is. Because notice that it has equal numbers of zeros and ones. There's just P zeros, then P ones. So that's a part of this language. So remember that this is indeed a part of, so I'm just going to put in parentheses, which is indeed in LEQ. Now, remember, the string has at least the pumping length in terms of the number of symbols, right? Its length is at least P, which is what we need over here for playing this game of bat and forth, okay? Okay. So, since the length of W is at least P, what does the pumping lemma say I can do then? It says that I should be able to decompose it, right? There exists a way to do that. Now, do you note that when I say there exists a way to do it, I don't actually tell you how I can do it, right? You don't have any control over that. If we're thinking of this like a game over there exists a way to do it. But I don't know what it is. I don't know how it's decomposing into the 3 parts. So my argument has to work regardless of that. But remember, it satisfies the pumping lemma by our assumption. So we have some properties we can use. And the point we're going to get at is we're going to try to show that the string that we picked is able to pump things that don't actually exist in the language. And we're going to try to take advantage of the fact that I picked this W very carefully. So please keep in mind that there's equal numbers of zeros and ones, but also, as I'm going to indicate later for you, notice that the first P symbols are all zeros. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's going to be your best friend in this argument and the way I picked W. So since the length of the string is at least P, then by the pumping lemma, right? Then there exists a way to divide W so that W is equal to X, Y, Z, where Y isn't empty, or Y isn't empty. The length of XY is at least the pumping length. And for all k greater or equal to 0, xy to the kz is in LEQ, right? So now we're going to try using these properties that we have because it satisfies the pumping lemma to come up with a statement where it's satisfying the property, but it also isn't satisfying the properties as well. That leads to a contradiction because you can't have it where it satisfies all 3 of the properties, but also fails to satisfy all 3 of the properties. Which is, like I said, at least one of these doesn't hold. That's the game I'm going to try playing. So, here we go. So remember, our game plan is to show that at least one of those has to fail simultaneously while I assume that all 3 of those properties hold. If that's the case, then we get a contradiction. Because you can't have both of those things at the same time, right? You can't get all 3 of the properties we originally listed over there while one of them failing at the exact same time, right? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. So, here we go. I'm getting really excited here. Since the length of xy is at least the pumping length, observe that xy consists solely of zeros. Right? Notice that the length of this string is 2p. 2 times the pumping length. But the first part, the first p symbols are all zeros. By that condition over there, that means xy is all zeros. So that's one thing I'll mention as an aside, and I'll talk much more about this next time, is how we pick this string plays a very big role of how we proceed in our argument. This is the main observation that will get us to our next step. So since this is at least p, observe that xy consists of all zeros. So what does that mean? Well, if I also know that y, at least under our assumption that it's regular, it has to be that y is non-empty, right? So y actually consists of at least one symbol. So this is how we're going to exploit this. So check this out. However, the length of y is at least 1. Remember, it's non-empty. It's a non-empty string, right? So, by the third property, by the third property, I should be able to just simply consider when k is something, right? Now, remember, if that property has to hold, it has to hold for all k's greater or equal to 1. Greater or equal to 0, sorry. I'm getting really just hyped up about this. So let's look at what happens if I consider x, y to the 0, z. What does that look like then? What's x, y to the 0, z? So remember, when I raise something to the power of 0, when I talk about a string, that's the empty string. That's just the exact same thing as writing xz. So if y has at least one 0 in it, what happens? What happens if I write down just xz? And remember, y takes away one of the zeros at least. So what would xz be a part of LEQ? It isn't. It can't be, because now there's less zeros than there are ones. So check this out. So x, y to the 0, z consists of less zeros than ones, implying x, y to the 0, z isn't in LEQ, which is a contradiction. I'm going to just cram it in the corner here just for dramatic purposes. It's down there. It says contradiction. It's sort of melting into the into my dolphin friend over here. And that concludes the proof. Do you notice how I was able to establish a string that should be satisfied by the third property, that should be in LEQ, but I've also shown you that there exists one by picking an appropriate k value among the ones that are supposedly supposed to work. I show you that it actually can't be in the language. So that string can't be in it and also not in it at the exact same time. That's a contradiction. So meaning that our assumption that LEQ is regular is wrong, right? It has to be not regular. But yeah, so for the pumping lemma, your best friend with the pumping lemma is to establish that languages aren't regular, and you can use it in this fashion. So contradiction is your best friend when applying the pumping lemma like this. So remember, the pumping lemma, let me just go over there and just to recap a couple quick things. And I assure you we'll see more examples in the future. So just remember, the pumping lemma says there exists the pumping length p such that for all strings in that language that are at least that length, the pumping length, there has to exist a way to write them like this, such that it has these properties. To refute this claim, it means that, imagine I give you, so it has to be that there exists a string such that no matter how you decompose it, remember, I don't know what the decomposition is here, I just know it exists, so somebody gives it to you. It has to be that at least one of these properties has to fail. So the idea is that if I assume that's true, then if I were to show you that one of these it fails, right? It can't be that one of these fails, but also all these are satisfied. That's what we did over here. But we'll see some more examples of showing languages are not regular using this type of argument. So if you want to see some more examples, we'll see more examples in the future. Are there any questions? Any questions at all? Any questions about the pumping lemma? Any questions at all? Don't be shy. I'm happy to answer any questions. The pumping lemma, I know for some students can be quite challenging, but please just remember, the whole idea here is that, and I will give more tips next time when we explore this. So it won't necessarily be next week, but it will be the week after that, I'm pretty sure, is the next time we'll be talking about the pumping lemma. Because I think we're talking about cryptography next time. So just remember that the game plan here is that if I know that there exists a pumping length, if I just take that as given, I would like to be able to show you that you can't have these two things, they don't live in the same world, right? But you'll notice in our argument over here, I just get it for free because I assume it, and then I just start playing the game of trying to show that if you assume this, and I can show you that this right here, specifically one of these has to fail, well, that's also true. That can't coexist, right? But yeah. Our little dinosaur friend would tell you, usually you pick this one. This is your best friend to go after. The strategy is very simple. You pick appropriate value K, and you try to pick W here. So you pick W such that it satisfies this length, so that no matter which decomposition you're given, because remember, if there exists one, most certainly one way you can refute this is by ignoring whatever it is. Just assume it exists, right? But you notice nowhere in my argument do I make any fixed presumptions other than I gave you the string, I craft the string that I give you such that I don't have to care about how the decomposition occurs. I know for a matter of fact, by the selection of W, that it consists only of zeros. Now, if you don't pick W properly, you end up with a lot of problems. So, for example, one thing that some students will try doing is getting half and half, putting half zeros, half ones. You may have to break it into possibly two cases if you do that. But there's other values that don't work, but I'll provide more examples about tips about picking these string and picking K next time. But there aren't any questions, but I know that we're having ourselves a good old time. And I want to wish you a wonderful day. And remember, if you want access to the notes for today, and I must stress that I'm also going to include the examples that I will be covering next time in the notes. So you can get access to these on Patreon in a little bit. So a little bit later today, they'll be available on Patreon and Subscribestar. So please just check out the links. And of course, if you enjoyed this, make sure you follow, tell your friends to come join the fun, like, comment, subscribe, do the thing. The thing. My little dinosaur friend says, do the thing, okay? Do the thing. So make sure you do the thing. My dinosaur friend tells you and compels you to do such a thing if you'd like to. And of course, consider supporting affordable computer science education and academics outside of universities, as is here.
Lesson. And have a great birthday.
Now, thank you for the birthday wishes. I'm going to have ourselves a beautiful day. I'm going to go bowling. But I'm going to be busy working here other than that, okay? So I'll say thank you so much, everybody. And if you're watching this in the future, thank you again. And looking forward to hanging out some more for more computer science educational content here and learning more computer science. And thank you again for all the suggestions and feedback I've received so far on the survey. Please, if you haven't yet, please complete the survey. I've gotten some topic suggestions, but please do reach out and check out my social media for that. On YouTube, for example, I do have the link in the description to the form for which you can complete it. It only takes about 1 or 2 minutes. So I'll say thank you so much, everybody, and have yourself a beautiful day. I'll see you later.